This iteration of the 997 Porsche 911 Speedster is a commemorative gift to Porsche from themselves to honor the original 356 Speedster built back in the 1950s. This car in this game is actually pretty interesting, and I will get more into that in the coming clips to showcase just how, quite frankly, ridiculous it is in terms of top speed, because it is something else, to be sure. It has the flat six that Porsche is known for, and it has a claimed top speed of around 190 miles an hour, which is respectable in the superclass. But honestly, I would say that it's outclassed by the 918 almost entirely, especially since the 918 is mid-engine rear-wheel drive, but this car is rear-engine rear-wheel drive. Now, going on about that top speed, it does hit that 190 miles an hour relatively quickly, all things considered. However, for whatever ungodly reason, this car's nitrous system is absolutely busted. It can hit top speeds of up to 230 up to 240 miles an hour under nitrous, which rivals the McLaren F1's original top speed. And this is in the superclass. And quite frankly, I think that's ridiculous, especially whenever it's supposed to be only hitting about 220-ish, and that's supposed to be with the turbo activated. But, like I said, for whatever reason, this car, when paired with nitrous, and especially the turbo, it can reach absolutely ridiculous speeds. It can rival exotic class cars with that top speed. But it can't hold that speed to save its life, and unfortunately it is uncontrollable at that speed, especially when you're trying to drift. And even if it could hold that top speed, I don't think it's a very good car in this tier, just because the acceleration, even in 7th gear, is super sluggish. But I would say that anywhere between like 3rd and 6th gear, I'd say is its strongest point, because the acceleration in those gears is pretty solid, but 1st and especially 2nd gear is so slow compared to, like I said, the 918, and even other cars in the tier like the SL65, which just outclass it entirely, especially in terms of drifting and handling. It can't hold its own. Even in terms of its other Porsche rivals like the GT3 RS and the 911 Turbo S Cabriolet, even those, I would say, those are probably better than this car. The 911 GT3 RS especially, since it is more race-focused and therefore has much better handling than this car. Because even though the GT3 RS is rear-engine rear-wheel drive as well, the spoiler and the extra downforce that it provides surfaces it much better than the active aero that this car offers. Now, by no means am I saying that this is a bad car at all. I actually quite like this car. This is one of my more favorite cars to mess around with, especially if I'm bored. But the access you have to this car is actually pretty limited, because it has a specific time trial, or rather gauntlet, that actually suits its capabilities perfectly. It starts with an open highway, and you can really see how fast it can go. And the cops aren't too overbearing, and it actually fares pretty well in pursuits, if you can maintain that high top speed, like I said. Now, speaking of pursuits, I wouldn't say that it's the ideal choice, since it is a fairly lightweight car, so its durability isn't perfect. But I would say it's serviceable enough to where if you wanted to use it in a hot pursuit, I wouldn't say you'd suffer too badly if you wanted to use it. So overall, I'd say this car definitely has its niche in the superclass as something that has a ridiculously high speed if you can maintain it. But unless you're able to do that, I would really just say stick with another car to use. Like I said, if it's available, the 918 Spider, I would say, is probably a bit better than this car. And probably the SL65, like I mentioned earlier, is also probably better than this car. In fact, the SL65 is probably the best car in the super tier. But overall, it's a really unique car. I will give it points where credit is due, because I would say this is probably one of my more favorite cars to use, but overall I would say that it's not the most spectacular car to use in a competitive scene, but that's just my opinion at least. So overall, like I said, it's a fun car to use if you're looking for a more experienced challenge and will get greatly rewarded, but again, like I said, it's just average, and I would say that its competitors mostly outclass it. Now, I want to move on to the cop side of things, because the 911 Speedster as a cop is completely unique. That is because it is the only convertible, or rather open-top car in the cop class. But that doesn't really matter in terms of its performance, and honestly, I hate to say it, but I would argue that it's worse as a cop car, because the handling is still just as unwieldy, especially at high speeds once again, but it doesn't even maintain that speed as well as it does as a racer. Cop cars in Hot Pursuit have their speed limited by nitros depending on what class that they're in. In this case, the superclass cars, or the Rapid Deployment series, have their nitro speed limited to about 207 under their own power under nitros. Even though I will give this car credit for having an unusually higher speed when cruising without nitros, because I think it is around 217, which is admittedly higher than the other rapid deployment cars. However, I will give it some good credit on being able to accelerate quickly enough to catch up to the racers, because even though it has that slightly decreased top speed compared to racers, the acceleration more than makes up for it, as is the quality of cop cars in this game. I would still say it's above average, and it is worth your time, once again, in more highway-based races. It once again falls apart whenever it tries turning, because, like I said, it still has that unwieldy handling, but I would argue that it's worse, because trying to countersteer with the cop version of the Speedster, it doesn't want to countersteer, and it makes it so much worse. And for that reason, I think it's one of the lesser used cop cars in the Rapid Deployment series, and I hate to say it, but it's just not worth it. I would still argue that it's not quite as useful as it should be. Again, just because that handling, especially when trying to countersteer, is just so unpredictable. And later in this run that you see here, you'll see just how bad it is. I would say that it's completely outclassed by, once again, another Porsche rival, but this time in the Panamera Turbo, because the Panamera, even though it has a much shallower turning radius, it's still much more serviceable, and it will most certainly outpace this car in turns, because the Panamera Turbo, I'll get more into it whenever I get around to that video, but it's a much faster cop car, just because the turning radius is much shallower, or rather, it's much more predictable. And the 911 Speedster, it's unfortunately just not usable in the Rapid Deployment series, and it's really unfortunate because it's a wholly unique car in the series, and it on paper has a lot to bring, but the handling just absolutely kills it. So the 911 Speedster as a car overall, I'd rate a 6 out of 10 for usability. Not bad, but still not the greatest car in the world, just if you really know how to use it.